So this is part two of the week 5 discussion, sort of a video lecture comments about the transatlantic slave trade and the Atlantic world in colonial days and such. And what we also need to talk about is the fact that slavery changed over the centuries. It was not the same in 1860 as it had been in 1619. And in fact, there were some in the early part of the 17th century up through about 16 through the end of the century almost. There were actually free blacks who owned property on the eastern shore of Virginia, and they actually owned African enslaved people themselves. It was very small, of course, but there were those people. And so you had there was a whole free black community on the eastern shore that there were planters who were Africans, and they enslaved Africans to work for them on their property. But that's the minute population, and it only lasted for a little while. But all of that to say, slavery, the nature of slavery changed, and there was a big shift with the end of the transatlantic slave trade by Congress in 1808. Provision in the Constitution had allowed, if the founders were hoping that slavery would die out or disappear by the time 1808 arrived, and in fact that didn't happen because the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin just ramped up the demand for cotton. The planters thought, oh, we can, instead of cleaning 5 pounds of cotton per day, an enslaved person can clean 55 pounds a day if we use this cotton gin. And so that just meant, oh, wait, we can make more money. Not we need fewer slaves. That meant, oh, we can make more money. So we need more enslaved people. So with the advent of the cotton gin, production actually ramped up, which meant that the planters needed more land. They needed more enslaved people, and so they could make more money. Well, in 1808, per the Constitution, Congress could determine that the transatlantic slave trade was illegal, and they could end the international slave trade, which they did January 1, 1808. Now, in New England, they had already started to abolish state by state, and those were state laws. In New England, they had started to abolish slavery soon after the Revolution. By the early 1800s, it was basically gone. Slavery was gone in New England. New England didn't have plantations. They were built on shipbuilding, lumber, shipping, small farms. They didn't need enslaved people. So for them, their economy was not tied to the enslavement of other humans. So it was not such a big deal for them to abolish slavery state by state, which that increasingly isolated the South because it was necessary for the people from Maryland down into Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and then eventually Tennessee, and it expanded in the 19th century. But there were as many stories and there were as many situations regarding slavery, the treatment of enslaved people, owners. There were as many different kinds of owners as there were different kinds of enslaved people. And there were as many different situations as all of those people mixed up together. So there was a lot of, you can't really make a blanket statement about slavery and assume that it was that way across the board. There are very few generalizations that can be made. All of that to say, Africans came to the Americas. They knew how to grow rice, so their skill, they had been growing rice in Africa for centuries. And so they knew all about how to grow rice. And so, particularly in the low country in South Carolina, rice was a big cash crop early on. And they would send the enslaved men into the rice paddies to work because the owners and the white men were scared to go into the swamps, basically, because of the risk of mosquito-borne illness. They found that, and they didn't know why at the time, but they found that the enslaved people did not contract the mosquito-borne illnesses like the white people did. And so they would eventually, they went in and they sent these guys in. They would go and work for 4 or 5 days, independent, no supervision, because the white owners were scared to go in because of the mosquito-borne illness. And so they would go and they would work in groups, and then they would go back to the plantation on the weekends or on Sundays. And so they were working on their own, and they were living fairly independent lives. There were other situations where you had artisans who these enslaved people had really good skills at barrel making, wheel making, glass blowing, all sorts of different skills. And so they were valued, and their owners might, like in Savannah, they might rent the enslaved person out for their labor to an artisan in town. They had group homes where these enslaved people could work during the week, and then they would go back on Sundays to the plantation and either take their wages, or they got to keep part of their wages, or they gave it all to the owner. But they were living with a curfew, of course. They were living fairly independently in town in Savannah and other places up and down the eastern seaboard. And if you have an option of living under the constant supervision of an overseer, or you can go be an artisan, and if you've got a skill, you can go live pretty independently in a group home, I'm all for the group home in town. But so there were a lot of different situations going on, and everybody had to make it work the best way they could. And so there were many. These were the exceptions, basically. You had a lot of gang labor where the people worked sun up to sundown. They worked in horrific conditions, and they lived in horrific conditions. They had to garden on their own. They had to fish because the owners, even up to George Washington, did not feed them enough. They got 2 sets of clothes for the winter and 2 sets of clothes for the summer, and that was it. And so even George Washington did not treat the enslaved people at Mount Vernon that well. They were always trying to find time to grow their own food and to hunt or fish, so that they could supplement the diet that they were given by the owner. These owners were rich. If you were well off enough to even have one enslaved person, you were considered rich. Not to mention the people who were considered planters and had over 100. You were considered a planter, and that was elite. They call it the planter elite. And those were people who had over 100 enslaved people. And that was where you have to understand why they were willing to go to war finally in the 1860s over this issue, because the really well-off people had more money tied up in their human property than their houses, their crops, their future crops, their land, everything combined was worth, their human property was worth more. So it's no wonder that they were willing to go to war over this, because that would have ruined all of these people. Now, did that mean that every Southerner owned enslaved people? No way. Vast majority did not. Of the people who were slaveholders, only 10% were considered to be planter elite, and that would have meant had over 100 enslaved people. So these people, this was not, every Southerner did not own enslaved people at all. in fact, the vast majority owned none. If you look at, I did the math one time and put into a Google calculator, and if you're an 18-year-old healthy African male would bring a price of $1,000 in 1860, that would be the equivalent of 29,000 some odd dollars today. So if you think about those kinds of terms, $1,000 was one thing in 1860. $1,000 is another thing today. But if you think about 29,000 plus, you can see that these people, everybody was not able to own an enslaved person, and they didn't all need enslaved people. They had a small farm. So many of them used family members for their, the families all worked together. But if you acquired land, you definitely could not work it by yourself, and you couldn't afford to pay people to do it, or you wouldn't have a profit. So it was the largest forced migration in human history. And if you look in 300 years, this is assuming that the transatlantic slave trade stopped in 1808. So that doesn't mean it actually stopped. That just means it stopped on paper, because the federal judges would find people who were smuggling in Africans after this, all the way up to 1859 with the Clotilde, is the name of a ship in Mobile Bay, that ran aground in Mobile Bay, and it was the last one, and it was in December of 1859, and that was the last ship. Many of the descendants from that ship, from the people on that ship, live in Africatown. It's a neighborhood in Mobile today. The second to the last ship was the Wanderer, and it ran aground. It didn't run aground. They landed on the beach off the coast of Jekyll Island, Georgia. So those were the last two, and that was in December of 1858, and then December of 1859 was the Clotilde in Mobile. So this was going on all the way after 1808. Just because it was a law did not mean it was followed. So these are the numbers of the Africans arriving in the Americas, and you see the degree to which the numbers change. So the Dutch were by far the fewest. The Spanish were next, the French, the English. This was in the West Indies, and which would be the Caribbean. And this is North America, so you had 427,000. Then you had 3.65 million Portuguese. The Portuguese brought that many, and they went into Brazil because they had the cane plantations. Now, the Portuguese did not stop slavery in Brazil until 1898, so that's 35 years longer, or 30 years longer than in the United States, for a total of 8.6 million. The numbers have been estimated up to between 10 and 12 million since these numbers were calculated. What all of this means is this: when we learn about slavery in American history, we think about it in terms of our part in slavery. In fact, we imported only 5% of the total number of Africans who were kidnapped from Africa. 95% went to the Caribbean and to South America. So that doesn't absolve us of anything, but what that means is that we had a very small piece of that part of slavery. The other thing is this: if we only brought in 427,000 from Africa directly, how did we end up with 4 million living African Americans in 1860-ish, when the Civil War started? It's called natural increase, and that means that these people were having babies. The owners in the United States wanted the Africans and African Americans to marry and have babies, because every time they did, the law said that the baby was whatever the mother was. If the mother was enslaved, then the baby was enslaved. And so that just multiplied the owner's wealth. And so they were encouraging these people to get married and have babies. And so you take this number total in 300 years, you take this number total, but yet you end up with millions upon millions of people who lived in this situation. But directly, 427,000 compared to this 3.65 million, we're a lot less than the Dutch even, as far as North America, British North America. But that doesn't absolve us of a thing. You look at the natural increase, and that makes a huge difference. Now, in the Caribbean, there was less natural increase, if any, because once you landed on a cane plantation in the Caribbean or in Brazil, your life expectancy was 2 years, because the working conditions were horrible. You had mosquito-borne illness, overwork, starvation, terrible conditions, and so your life expectancy was 2 years or less. And so they had a huge turnover. So the Portuguese had to keep going back to Africa for more enslaved people because they kept dying off. So to keep that labor force going, they had to keep going back for more and more. And so that became an issue. Whereas in the United States, once we got through the initial colonization in the 1600s with Jamestown and the Starving Time, and once things kind of settled out a little bit, the natural increase began because the conditions were better. They were sheltered. They had food. They had enough food to survive off of. They weren't necessarily, yes, there were epidemics, there was mosquito-borne illness, but the conditions were much better, and so the health of the moms was much better, and so there was a lot less death, and so for everybody, for all people, but you had this natural increase among these enslaved people. So there's that. The difference. There were differences in slavery among the Muslims and among the Europeans. This was the view of the Europeans about Africans. This was the view of Muslims about Africans or enslaved people. The Muslims enslaved people because they needed porters, concubines, which means like kept women, cooks, personal attendants. They did not engage in lifetime slavery. In Africa, the slaves were, the Africans enslaved other Africans. And what they did was they would be prisoners of war, or they would basically enslave somebody to repay a debt. And then but the enslaved person could go home to their own house and their own family at night, and then they would come back and work. They just worked for no money. And so there were many different situations there too. And that's, you can't make these broad generalizations. But the idea is that United States slavery set up like no other. There was nowhere on earth that slavery turned out to be like it was here. And so the thing is, and this is part of the point of the 1619 Project, is that the slavery here was the root of everything, both good and bad, for this country. And the racial issues that we have today relate directly to slavery, and it still goes on today. And I'll write some more about that. I want to post some information about the 1619 Project because it's worth looking at. So, sugar and slavery. If there had not been sugar in the Americas, likely there would have been slavery would have gone away. It would have gone away by the the wayside. If you look at the amount of sugar in pounds exported from the Americas, this is what you get. You had 294,000 pounds. And then you had in the next 1601 to 1700, now you have 1 million. 1701 to 1800, now you have nearly 5.5 million. And then it's in decline again at 1800. So this was the biggest century for the sugar exports, but sending it all to Europe, of course, because they can't grow sugar in that cold weather. But you look at this, and you look at these numbers, and so that is, you can see how it went up, increased, and then finally was in decline by 1870. So this transformation of Africa, they traded with the Africans originally, the Portuguese and the Spanish, but now they were trading in Africans, meaning as a commodity. 90% of the Africans that were captured ended up in the Americas in the cane fields, which was the Caribbean and Brazil. The Africans sold their prisoners of war, and sometimes they would create wars so that they could get some more prisoners of war. They would cause wars with neighboring tribes so that the king or the chief could get more prisoners of war. So then the Europeans in 1730, they start trading in weapons, and then the English, the ones that went to English North America, they were in this part of Africa. Now, what's interesting is that I actually have sub-Saharan African DNA. And this is where my DNA shows up, in this part of Africa. So it's most interesting that, and I had to kind of come to terms with it because my relatives would have been culprits in this. But this is where they came from as far as coming to North America. This is the Middle Passage, the waterborne journey, which is from Africa to basically the Caribbean. And then they would, the distribution would be for us to British North America, but it also would be to Brazil. So I hope that gives you some information. I will post some more information about the 1619 project. And if you have any questions at all, just let me know.